What she was about to say could end everything before it began. With 45 minutes left on their first date, she had to tell him she was a convicted felon. She braced for disgust, for the hurried check, for another door slamming shut on her future. But his reaction wasn't anger or fear. It was a quiet story about his late wife, a public defender who built her life on the belief that people deserve a second chance. And in that moment, he offered her one. This isn't just one date. It's the reality for over 70 million Americans living with a record, where a single confession can shatter a new connection. We are about to explore the hidden emotional calculus of dating with a past, the science of stigma, and the profound question: when someone has paid their debt to society, does anyone owe them a chance at love? Meet Elena. After 3 years of rebuilding her life, her record wasn't a file in a courthouse. It was a third person on every date, sitting silently between her and anyone new, waiting to be introduced. The charge was forgery, a desperate choice at 22 to help a boyfriend she now barely remembers. She served her time, completed parole, and found stable work. But in the economy of modern dating, her past was treated as a non-negotiable debt. The math of disclosure was brutal. Tell someone immediately on an app, the match would vanish before the conversation started. Mention it on the first date. She watched their eyes glaze over with a calculation she knew well: risk assessment. Wait until feelings developed. That was the greatest gamble of all, betting genuine connection against the bedrock fear of betrayal. Studies quantify this emotional minefield. Research published in the journal Corrections confirms that while stable romantic relationships are one of the strongest predictors of successful reintegration, the stigma of a record actively blocks access to them. It's a cruel paradox. To stay out of trouble, you need support. To get support, you must first navigate a gauntlet of rejection. Elena developed a script. She would wait for the third date after rapport was built but before intimacy deepened. She'd choose a public but quiet place. She'd be factual, not defensive. She practiced in the mirror. There's something I need to tell you about my past. I made a serious mistake when I was younger. The reactions followed a pattern she could chart. The polite retreat, the abrupt end to the evening, the ghosting. One man told her bluntly, "I just can't have that in my life." The rejection wasn't just personal, it was structural. Devar Page's landmark research found a criminal record cuts callback rates for jobs in half. Landlords routinely deny applications. This societal no echoes in the romantic sphere, teaching people like Elena that their past is a permanent, defining trait. The psychological toll is documented. This stigma leads to social withdrawal, secrecy, and a decreased quality of life, layering new trauma on top of the old. But here, where the data gets surprising, not all disclosures are equal. A controlled speed dating study found the type of crime matters dramatically. When men disclosed a property crime like Elena, women's interest plummeted. Yet disclosures of assault or drug convictions didn't have the same negative effect. The researchers were stunned. It suggests our fears aren't always logical. We judge the crime of desperation, the theft, the forgery, more harshly than crimes of violence or addiction in this intimate context. Furthermore, the study revealed a stark gender divide. When women disclosed their convictions, the men's interest didn't waver. This imbalance adds another layer of complexity for the millions of women with records, facing a judgment men simply don't. For Elena, each rejection reinforced a wall. She began to self-sabotage, picking partners she sensed wouldn't last, subconsciously protecting herself from the pain of the real conversation. Her friends, weary of the cycle, suggested she just stop telling people. "It was years ago," they'd say. "It's not who you are now." But the weight of the secret felt heavier than the weight of the truth. The research is clear. Secrecy as a coping strategy is corrosive, feeding the very isolation that leads people back into crisis. Then she matched with Ben. His profile was unassuming, a single dad, a woodworker, photos of him laughing with a little girl. Their conversation was easy, devoid of the pressured flirtation she'd grown to dread. He asked about her family, her favorite book, the reason she loved her job at the community garden. For the first time in years, she felt seen for the present tense person she was, not prejudged for the past tense person she had been. The first date was coffee. He was kind, grounded, and spoke about his daughter with a tenderness that disarmed her. The second date was a walk in the park. As they talked, Elena felt the familiar script rising in her throat, the urge to confess before she got in too deep, but she hesitated. This felt different. The potential for loss felt exponentially greater. Now, as she sits across from him at a small Italian restaurant on their third date, the untouched bread basket between them, the calculus is complete. The moment has arrived. The evening is going perfectly, which makes what she has to do next feel like a form of self-sabotage. She takes a sip of water, her hands steady but her heart a drum against her ribs. She has rehearsed this 100 times. "Ben, there's something I need to tell you." He looks up, his expression open and curious, completely unaware that the next 90 seconds will determine if everything they've started building gets torn down before it can truly begin. The words hung in the air between them, a truth bomb with a 3-second fuse. Ben didn't recall, he didn't reach for the check. He just went very, very still, and in that silence, Elena braced for an ending she had memorized. "Forgery," she had said, her voice barely above the restaurant's murmur. "I was convicted of forgery. I served 16 months and I've been out for 3 years." She kept her eyes on her hands, folded in her lap, unable to watch the shift in his face. She explained the condensed clinical version, the bad influence, the desperation, the arrest that felt like both a catastrophe and a release. She did not cry. She had trained herself not to. Finally, he spoke. "Thank you," he said, "for telling me." It was not the response she expected. It wasn't acceptance, but it wasn't rejection. It was a door left slightly ajar. "You're probably wondering why I didn't say anything sooner," she continued, the script flowing out of her. "Actually," Ben interrupted gently, "I was wondering how many times you've had to have this exact conversation." The question disarmed her completely. In all her rehearsals, no one had ever asked that. They asked for details, they judged the crime, they worried about what it meant for them. No one had ever quantified the cumulative weight of the confession itself. She told him 7 first dates, 3 second dates, 2 third dates including this one, 12 potential connections terminated by a single fact. Ben listened, not as a judge, but as a witness. He asked about the job she'd lost after the background check, about the apartment application that was denied. He was mapping the periphery of her life, tracing the shape of the obstacles she navigated daily. And then he began to tell a story of his own, not about a crime, but about the law. "My late wife," he said, "was a public defender." He spoke her name, Claire, with a softness that conveyed an entire history. He described her idealism, her battered briefcase, her endless hours spent with people the world had given up on. She had this saying, Ben recalled, a faint smile touching his lips. She'd say, "The system is designed to define people by their worst moment. My job is to remind them, and everyone else, that a moment is not a lifetime." For Elena, this was the pivotal twist. The man across from her wasn't just a potential partner, he was the living legacy of someone who had built her career on the principle of second chances. The date was no longer a personal evaluation. It had become a test of a deeply held belief, inherited through love and loss. But this is where the real-world data intrudes on the romantic narrative. While Ben's personal history makes him uniquely predisposed to empathy, he is a statistical outlier. Research into the psychology of stigma shows that when we learn of a criminal record, our brains engage in a rapid risk assessment that is profoundly anti-empathic. We categorize, we distance ourselves, we see the label, not the person. This isn't just cruelty, it's a cognitive shortcut, one that Claire fought against professionally every single day. The study from the journal Corrections pinpoints the consequence. This stigma directly limits access to the very pro-social relationships, like romantic partnerships, that are proven to be the strongest firewall against reoffending. It's a devastating feedback loop. Society fears the person with a record, denies them the stabilizing bonds they need to succeed, and then points to their subsequent instability as proof the fear was justified. And the damage isn't only external. Code for America's analysis of mental health impacts describes an internal erosion. The discrimination of stigma causes what they term social pain, a profound loneliness, and a hypervigilant worry that others think less of you. For Elena, this manifested as a constant editing of her own life story, a fear of casual questions about her 20s, the strategic avoidance of any topic that might lead back to those lost years. The past became a room in her mind she was always trying to keep locked. which meant she was always thinking about the lock. Ben, intuitively perhaps, seemed to understand this. He didn't offer easy absolution. He didn't say it's okay or that doesn't matter. Instead, he asked, what was the hardest part about coming home? The question unlocked something. She told him about the silence, not the silence of prison, but the silence that greeted her after. Friends who didn't know what to say, so they said nothing. Family conversations that carefully tiptoed around the gaping hole of those missing years. The way her own history felt like a forbidden subject, making her feel like a ghost in her own life. This is the lesser-known trauma of reintegration, the emotional isolation. A study examining the impact of criminal record stigma on quality of life found that perceived stigma was a significant predictor of secrecy, coping strategies, and social withdrawal. People, fearing rejection, preemptively pull away, creating the very loneliness they dread. Their dinner stretched long past the point when the waiter stopped hovering. The conversation meandered from the painful to the mundane, his daughter's upcoming school play, her plans for the community garden in the spring. It was a bizarre, beautiful duality. They were having two conversations simultaneously, one about a profound, life-altering revelation, and another about the ordinary rhythms of two people getting to know each other. As they stepped out into the cool night air, Elena felt a fatigue deeper than tiredness. It was the exhaustion of a marathon she hadn't known she was running. Ben walked her to her car. "I'd like to see you again," he said, his voice firm, "but I need to be honest with you too. This isn't just about me. I have a daughter. Her safety, her stability, that's my entire world. I need to think about what this means, not for a date, but for a life." His honesty was more respectful than any instant, glib acceptance could have been. He was treating the stakes with the gravity they deserved. She drove home in a state of suspended animation. There was no euphoria, only the quiet hum of averted disaster and the terrifying possibility of something new. For the next 72 hours, Elena existed in a state of hyperanalysis. Every text notification was a potential verdict. When Ben did text, it was to ask if she'd like to meet for a walk that weekend, somewhere public, somewhere his daughter could come along. The inclusion of his child was a message in itself. This was not a hidden, compartmentalized affair. He was introducing her to the core of his responsibility. The walk was awkward and beautiful. His daughter, Sophie, was a whirlwind of 6-year-old energy, more interested in chasing pigeons than the nuanced dynamics between the adults. Elena talked to her about gardening, about worms being nature's recyclers, and earned a giggle of disgusted delight. She and Ben talked about everything except the confession. It was a deliberate, mutual construction of normalcy, a test to see if a foundation could be built beside the fault line of her past. And it's here that we must confront the central tension their story illustrates. Can a relationship founded on such an asymmetrical disclosure ever be equal? The power dynamics are skewed from the start. One person carries a stigmatized history, a permanent vulnerability. The other holds the power of social judgment, the ability to revoke acceptance. This imbalance can fester, transforming the person with the record into a perpetual applicant, grateful for any scrap of continued approval. This isn't theoretical. Relationship counselors who work with formerly incarcerated individuals note this as a major point of conflict. The fear of triggering rejection can lead to a loss of voice, a reluctance to express needs or disagreements. The partner, even with the best intentions, can unknowingly become a warden of a different kind, their acceptance felt as a conditional gift. Ben was navigating this minefield blindly. He wanted to be the man his wife believed people could be, someone who looked forward, not backward. But he was also a father, and a primal protectiveness clashed with his principles. He found himself doing things he was ashamed of, a casual Google search of her name, a drive past the community garden to see it was real, a hesitant conversation with a lawyer friend about the specifics of forgery penalties. This is the uncharted territory after the confession. The partner who stays enters a landscape of unspoken calculations and quiet fears. The research has barely begun to study their asterisk psychology, the weight of being the keeper of a stigmatized secret, the social judgment they might face by association. Ben's internal conflict was a microcosm of society's larger debate. Where does reasonable caution end, and where does prejudicial stigma begin? A week after the walk, Ben asked to see her again, just the two of them. He chose a diner, a place of fluorescent lights and no romantic pretense. Elena's heart sank. The neutral, public venue felt like a courtroom. She prepared for the gentle letdown, the "you're wonderful" but speech she knew so well. He waited until after they'd ordered. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," he began, and Elena's hand tightened around her coffee mug. "About Claire, about Sophie, about you." He took a breath. "I believe people can change. I have to believe that, or I don't know how to make sense of the world. But believing it in theory and building a life on it, that's different." He looked at her directly. "So I need to ask you a question, and I need you to be completely honest. It's the only thing that matters to me now." The diner noise faded into a buzz. This was it. The final question. Was she on parole? Did she still have connections to that old life? Was she a risk? Ben leaned forward. "When you look at your life now," he asked, his voice low and intent, "who do you see? The person who made that mistake, or the person who got out of bed every day for the last 3 years and built something better?" The question was a seismic shift. He wasn't asking about the past. He was asking about the present. He was asking for her self-perception. In that moment, Elena realized the confession on the third date was only part A. This was part B, the audit of her recovery, the assessment of who she had built herself into. Her answer would determine everything, but before she could speak, Ben's phone buzzed violently on the table. He glanced at it, frowned, and his face paled. It was a text from his babysitter, just 3 words: "Sophie is asking for you, now." The diner, the unanswered question, the fragile future, all of it evaporated. "It's her asthma," Ben said, already standing, his chair scraping loudly. "She's at the ER." He looked at Elena, a stark, unvarnished conflict in his eyes. In a crisis, do you lean on the new person with the complicated past, or do you protect your child from any possible variable? "Go," Elena said immediately, her own concerns forgotten. "Just go." But Ben hesitated for a fraction of a second. "Come with me," he said, the words surprising them both. It wasn't a romantic gesture. It was a practical one, born of panic and a sudden, overwhelming need for support. In that moment, her past was irrelevant. He needed another adult, and in her response, he would see the person she was now. The drive to the hospital was a silent, tense blur. In the sterile chaos of the pediatric emergency room, Elena became a shadow. She fetched coffee, found blankets, relayed messages from the nurse when Ben was in with Sophie. She was useful, calm, and unobtrusive. She watched Ben, his face etched with a fear that transcended all other concerns, and understood with brutal clarity that her forgery conviction meant nothing compared to the terror of a child struggling to breathe. This is the brutal reprioritization a crisis forces. The theoretical risk of a person's past collapses against the immediate, visceral reality of a present emergency. For Ben, the principle of second chances was being stress-tested in real time. And for Elena, it was an unasked-for audition to prove her stability in the storm. As the adrenaline faded and Sophie, stabilized with medication, drifted into an exhausted sleep, the delayed conversation resumed in hushed tones in the harshly lit waiting area. Ben looked shattered. "You asked who I see," Elena said quietly, picking up the thread he'd dropped hours before. "I see the person who sat in a prison cell and decided that wasn't the end of her story. I see the person who got certified in horticultural therapy because she wanted to help things grow. I see someone who is terrified of being defined by a single, awful choice, but who gets up every day and tries to build evidence to the contrary." Ben didn't respond with words. He simply reached over and took her hand, his grip tight. It was an answer. In the crucible of the hospital, her past had not been a liability, her present had been an asset. But this is where the narrative diverges from a simple feel-good story. The acceptance of one man, however profound, does not erase the systemic wall Elena faces. This single point of connection is the exception that proves the rule of millions of rejections. And the fragility of that connection was about to be tested from an entirely new angle. A week after the hospital scare, Ben invited Elena to a casual barbecue at his sister's house. "Just family," he'd said. It was a monumental step, integrating her into his private world. Elena felt a new kind of anxiety, not about her record, but about the normal scrutiny any new partner faces from a protective family. The afternoon was warm, filled with the smell of charcoal and the sound of children playing. Ben's sister Laura was warm but watchful. The conversation flowed easily until Laura's husband, Mark, a friendly, bluff man, made an offhand comment. "So, Elena, Ben says you work with the community garden? That's great. Much better than being chained to a desk like the rest of us sinners." The table laughed, but then Mark, refilling drinks, continued, "Yeah, gotta enjoy that fresh air. Not like you're on parole or anything, right?" He elbowed Ben playfully, completely unaware of the landmine he'd just detonated. The table fell silent. Laura's eyes widened in horrified understanding. Ben froze, a look of sheer panic on his face. He hadn't told them. In his desire to protect Elena's story, to let her be seen for who she was now, he had made a catastrophic error. He had forced her into a public moment of disclosure she had not chosen. Every piece of research on stigma underscores the critical importance of narrative control. The psychological impact of stigma is profoundly tied to a loss of agency, the feeling that your identity is dictated by a mark you did not choose. In that moment, Elena's hard-won control over her own story was ripped away. She was exposed, not on her terms, but as the subject of a clumsy joke. "Actually," Elena said, her voice remarkably steady, I completed parole 2 years ago." She held Mark's stunned gaze, then looked at Laura's appalled expression. She offered a tight, painful smile. "The garden is part of that, a fresh start." She then excused herself and walked into the house, seeking the bathroom as a temporary bunker. The fallout was immediate and multi-layered. Ben was furious, at himself, at Mark. Laura was hurt that Ben hadn't trusted her. Mark was mortified. And Elena, she was back in the familiar, icy isolation of being the one with the record. The label was now the primary, and perhaps only, thing his family would see. This incident reveals a secondary layer of stigma often borne by the partners and families of those with records, courtesy stigma. By associating with Elena, Ben's judgment was now in question. His family would worry he was being naive, that he was risking Sophie's well-being. His decision to give a second chance was now a subject of family debate, dissected in phone calls he wasn't part of. The research is sparse but clear on this ripple effect. A study on social rejection notes that individuals can be devalued simply through their association with a stigmatized person. Ben was no longer just a single dad dating a woman. He was a single dad making a controversial, risky choice. The pressure on their relationship now came not just from within, but from a circle of concerned loved ones armed with societal bias. For Elena, the barbecue was a devastating setback. The trust she'd built with Ben felt fractured. He had, through omission, created a situation where she was ambushed. "Why didn't you tell them?" she asked him later, the anger finally breaking through her controlled facade. "I wanted them to see you first," he pleaded. "I didn't want that to be the first thing they knew." "But it's part of me," she fired back. "You hiding it felt like you were ashamed of it, and if you're ashamed of it, how can you not eventually be ashamed of me?" This is the core psychological wound of stigma, internalized shame. Code for America's analysis calls it a constant worry that others think less of you. Ben's well-intentioned secrecy had accidentally confirmed Elena's deepest fear, that her past was inherently shameful, something to be concealed. It triggered what researchers term secrecy coping strategies, a retreat into self-protective isolation that undermines the very connection she sought. The argument that followed was their first real fight, and it wasn't about dishes or finances. It was about identity, trust, and the unbearable weight of a past that kept resurfacing. Ben realized too late that by trying to shield her, he had invalidated the very journey she was on, the journey from that past to this present. Acceptance required acknowledging the whole path, not just the destination. In an attempt to bridge the chasm, Ben did something unexpected. He asked Elena if she would be willing to talk to his sister, Laura, one-on-one. "She's worried," he said, "not about you being a bad person, but about me being a bad father. She doesn't understand. Maybe you can help her." This was uncharted, terrifying territory. It meant voluntarily facing the judgment of a key person in Ben's life, without him as a buffer. But it was also a chance to reclaim her narrative, to explain context, to be a human being instead of a case file. The meeting at a coffee shop was agonizingly polite. Laura, a school teacher, was direct. "I love my brother. Sophie is my whole heart. I just need to understand how this works." Elena didn't talk about the crime. She talked about the aftermath. She described the grueling work of rebuilding a life from scratch, the rejected applications, the lonely nights, the therapy, the deliberate choice to work with plants and soil because it was a tangible way to nurture something good. She spoke about her own fears, about never feeling like she had a right to a normal life, a family, love. She wasn't asking for sympathy, she was offering understanding, and she saw Laura's defensiveness slowly melt into a reluctant, then genuine, empathy. "Ben told me what his wife believed," Laura said softly. "I guess I never really knew what that looked like in real life until now." This micro-resolution with Laura was a tiny victory, but it highlighted the immense labor required of people with records. They must constantly educate, assuage fears, and perform rehabilitation, not just for the state, but for every new person in their lives. The emotional tax is exhausting. Just as they began to find their footing again, a letter arrived. It was from the State Licensing Board. Elena had applied months ago for a formal certification to expand her horticultural therapy work into schools and rehabilitation centers. The letter was a request for additional information and a formal interview regarding her criminal conviction. Her past, a dormant file, had been officially reactivated by her ambition to move forward. This is the cruel irony of the system. Steps toward pro-social, meaningful work, the very steps that reduce recidivism, are often the ones that trigger the deepest scrutiny. The background check, the character assessment, the invasive interviews. Progress requires inviting the past back into the room for interrogation. The certification process became a shared trial. Ben helped her prepare, role-playing tough interview questions. He witnessed firsthand the bureaucratic gauntlet she faced, the humiliating necessity of proving her worthiness over and over. It solidified his understanding in a way abstract empathy never could. He was no longer just the partner offering a chance. He was an ally fighting a systemic barrier. The day of her final interview arrived. It was held in a Stark government office. The panel asked about her crime, her rehabilitation, her plans. Toward the end, one older interviewer leaned back and asked, "Given your history, why should we trust you with vulnerable populations?" Elena took a breath. She thought of Ben, of Sophie, of the garden, of the quiet life she was building. "Because," she said, her voice clear, "I understand what it means to be vulnerable, and I understand what it means to rebuild. I'm not asking you to trust who I was, I'm asking you to evaluate who I am." A week later, the approval letter came. It was a professional victory, but more than that, it was tangible, state-sanctioned evidence of her change. It was a document she could hold, a counter-narrative to the court papers. That night, Ben took her out to celebrate. At the restaurant, he slid a small box across the table. "It wasn't a ring, it was a key. To my house," he said. "Sophie helped me pick out the keychain." It was a simple, staggering act of practical trust. It meant she belonged in their daily space, their safe place. But as Elena took the key, feeling its cold, solid weight, a final, daunting truth settled over her. The confession on the third date was just the beginning. The real work of a second chance wasn't in the dramatic moment of revelation, but in the quiet, daily choice to believe in it. And that choice wasn't just Ben's to make. It was now hers too. Did she believe she deserved the key, the trust, the family that was being offered? Or would the ghost of her old self forever hold her back from stepping fully through the door? The key in her hand was a theory made metal. For the next 6 months, Elena's life became a living experiment. Could a relationship born from a confession survive the mundane, unglamorous work of building an actual shared life? The answer unfolded in quiet moments, not grand gestures. It was in the domestic logistics of a shared calendar, marking her nights at Ben's house, Sophie's school events, and Elena's community garden workshops. It was in the negotiation of space, a drawer for her clothes, a shelf for her books, a corner of the garage for her gardening tools. Each small integration was a silent referendum on her permanence. The research on desistance from crime points to this exact phenomenon. Stability begets stability. The predictable rhythms of a prosocial life, dinner times, school runs, weekend plans, create a structure that displaces the chaos that often leads to crisis. For Elena, the simple act of being expected somewhere by someone was a powerful antidote to the rootlessness she felt after release. But the past was not erased, it was compartmentalized. There were still moments of friction where the two worlds collided. A planned weekend trip was almost cancelled when Elena realized the route passed within miles of the correctional facility she'd been in. She froze, a visceral reaction she couldn't control. Ben, to his credit, didn't dismiss it. He simply rerouted the trip, no questions asked. It was a practical solution that acknowledged the ghost without giving it power. The larger test came from the outside world. Elena's certified horticultural therapy program launched at a local youth center. The local newspaper ran a small, positive piece about it, and attached to the online version was a comment, anonymous and venomous: "Maybe they should check who's teaching these kids. Felons shouldn't be around children." It was a single comment, likely from a troll, but it landed with the force of a physical blow. It confirmed her deepest, most paranoid fear that no amount of certification, no years of clean living would ever be enough for some people. Her record was a permanent filter through which her good works could be distorted. Ben wanted to rage, to report the comment, to fight back. Elena felt the old urge to withdraw, to make herself small and invisible to avoid further attack. This is the exhausting dynamic of stigma, the constant emotional labor required from both the target and their allies. They spent the evening talking it through, not about the commenter, but about their responses. They settled on a strategy of radical transparency. The youth center director, already fully aware of Elena's history, issued a statement of full support. They chose to meet the stigma with sunlight and institutional backing, robbing the anonymous accusation of its power to shame. This incident, however, prompted a deeper conversation between Elena and Ben about the future, specifically about Sophie. They had been careful, letting the bond between Elena and the little girl grow organically through gardening projects and bedtime stories, but children asked direct questions. One afternoon, while potting seedlings, Sophie looked up and asked, "Elena, did you know my other mom, the one in heaven?" The question hung in the sunny kitchen. "I didn't know her, sweetie," Elena said gently, "but I know she was a very good person who helped a lot of people." Sophie nodded, thoughtful. "Daddy says you help people too, with plants." It was a child's simple logic, drawing a connection of purpose, not of replacement. But it forced the adult issue. What was Elena's role to be? The fun adult friend? A parental figure? The research on children with a formerly incarcerated step-parent is virtually non-existent, leaving them to chart their own course with no map. Ben decided on a policy of age-appropriate honesty. He didn't sit Sophie down for a heavy talk. Instead, he wove it into the fabric of their family story. He explained that everyone has things in their past they wish they could change, and that Elena had worked very hard to build a new, good life. He framed it as a story of strength and change, not of sin and punishment. Sophie, with a child's astounding capacity for acceptance, simply said, "Okay, can we water the tomatoes now?" This was perhaps the most profound validation. The person most vulnerable in Ben's eyes, his daughter, judged Elena not by a distant mistake, but by her present actions, her patience, her kindness, her ability to grow a really cool pumpkin. A year after the confession in the Italian restaurant, Elena faced a final internal hurdle, her own self-concept. She realized she was waiting for the other shoe to drop, for Ben to finally see the flaw he had overlooked. In therapy, she identified this as the last vestige of internalized stigma, the belief that she was fundamentally damaged goods, and that his love was therefore a temporary loan, not a permanent gift. To break this, she did something that terrified her. She applied for a grant to start a citywide program pairing community gardens with re-entry services. The application required a personal statement. For the first time, she wrote not just about her crime, but about the entire journey: the shame, the isolation, the hard-won stability, and the role that a single, loving relationship played in solidifying her new path. She submitted it, feeling emotionally naked. The grant was approved. The surprise wasn't the approval itself, but the reaction. At the small award ceremony, a city official shook her hand and said, "Your story is exactly why this program exists. It's about investing in people who are investing in themselves." In that moment, the narrative officially flipped. Her past was no longer just a liability to be disclosed. It was part of her expertise, the source of her empathy and drive. Her stigma had been transformed, through action and context, into a credential. This reflects a broader, emerging shift in some corners of the justice system. The concept of procedural justice emphasizes that when people feel they are treated fairly and with dignity, they are more likely to obey the law. Elena's experience with Ben, being treated as a whole person worthy of trust, mirrored this principle in the personal sphere, motivating further pro-social behavior. On a cool autumn evening, 2 years after they met, Ben asked Elena to marry him. It wasn't with a ring at a restaurant. It was in the community garden at the end of a volunteer day with dirt on their hands. Sophie presented the ring box, grinning. "Do you promise to help us with the garden forever?" she asked, getting the questions slightly wrong. Elena laughed, crying, and said yes to them both. Their wedding was small, in a park filled with flowers she had helped plant. Laura was a bridesmaid. Mark gave a heartfelt, apologetic toast. Sophie was the flower girl and the self-appointed ring security guard. Elena's side of the aisle included friends from the garden and one woman from her old support group, a living testament to the community she'd built. The final, surprising detail came in Ben's vows. He spoke of his late wife, Claire. He said, "She spent her career arguing that people are more than their worst moment. I loved her for that belief. With you, Elena, I get to live it. You are the proof her life's work was real." In that moment, the three storylines, Elena's redemption, Ben's healing from loss, and Claire's legacy, converged into a single, resilient family. It was a resolution that honored the past without being imprisoned by it. Today, Elena's program has expanded to 3 gardens. She employs 2 other people with non-violent records. Ben's woodworking business is thriving. Sophie is in 3rd grade and tells her friends her stepmom teaches people how to grow second chances. The comments section on the local news website is still sometimes ugly, but it's now filled with more supporters than detractors, a small signal of changing perception. Their story is not a fairy tale. They still have arguments, financial worries, and the occasional anxiety spike when a background check form appears. But the foundation is no longer the confession, it's the 1,000 days of trust built after it. The data tells us that among people sent to prison for the first time, only about 1/3 or fewer commit new offenses. The majority, like Elena, are trying to move forward, often invisibly. Their success depends not just on their own will, but on the willingness of others, employers, landlords, friends, and partners to make a choice, to see the person, not just the record, to offer a seat at the table. Elena and Ben's story is one data point in a vast, ongoing human experiment. It proves that a second chance at love is possible, but it also illuminates the sheer amount of courage, communication, and unwavering choice required from both sides to make it work. It is a private victory and a public blueprint. Elena and Ben found their way, but their story is the exception, not the rule. For every connection that holds, countless others fracture under the weight of a single checked box on a background check. Their happy ending doesn't invalidate the data. It highlights the staggering human potential that is lost when we automatically say no. The science is clear yet contradictory. We know stable love reduces recidivism, yet we structure our social reactions to make that love nearly impossible to find. We judge the crime of forgery, born of desperation, more harshly in romance than crimes of violence. We place a heavier burden of disclosure on women than on men. Our fears are not a map of actual risk, but a reflex. So we are left with the unresolved question that hangs over all 70 million stories. When does punishment end? Is it when the sentence is served, when the parole is complete, or is it only when the last person decides to stop judging, to offer a job, an apartment, a seat at a table, or a key to their home? The story of a second chance is never just about the person receiving it. It is equally about the courage of the person offering it, the courage to question their own biases, to face social judgment, to believe in redemption as a practical verb, not an abstract noun. It is about building a new norm where a past mistake is part of a person's history, but not the entirety of their future. What Elena and Ben built in that garden, in that home, is a small, quiet rebellion against a culture of permanent suspicion. It is proof that on the other side of a difficult confession, there can be a deeper, more intentional kind of trust. Their life together is a daily answer to the question his late wife dedicated her career to: people are always more than their worst moment. If this story changed your perspective, even slightly, consider what that shift might mean. It might mean the difference between a door closing or opening for someone in your own community. These are the private choices that, in aggregate, write our collective future. Thank you for listening. For more documentaries that explore the hidden human stories behind the headlines, hit subscribe. We'll see you in the next one.